Hi, my name is Sherry H., and welcome to my podcast, Care in Memory Shadow. This is the first episode of my podcast, and I want to begin by starting with why this space exists. The space exists to bring attention to the things we often don't see or consider when making medical decisions for ourselves or our loved ones. Care in Memory Shadow was not born from what I've read, not what I was told, but what I have seen in my own eyes and carried in my heart. It is what I have lived and carried with me. The years of watching loved ones move through treatments and care, through diagnosis and misdiagnosis, through medications meant to help, but often causing harm. It comes from standing in places where information was missing and decisions were rushed. It was born in hospital and waiting rooms and quiet conversations. In moments where diagnosis changed, where treatments multiplied, and where medication left behind confusion, side effects, and unanswered questions. It comes from navigating a system that often expects families to make life-altering decisions without giving them the full picture, without the required time, clarity, or language needed to truly understand what those decisions will cost. I have watched care become routine, memory become fragile, and love take on new forms of responsibility. I have learned that long-term care is not just medical, it is emotional, spiritual, and deeply human. The space exists for those who have stood in that shadow, trying to advocate, trying to understand, trying to do right by someone they love. Here, we talk about what is often left unsaid. We name what is confusing, painful, and overlooked. And we create space for knowledge, compassion, and informed choices because care should never exist without understanding. And no one should have to walk this journey without the information needed to make the best decisions for their loved ones. Today's episode is When Help Begins to Harm. What I learned walking beside my sister. This episode is deeply personal. It is inspired by my sister. For more than 8 years of caring for her, advocating for her, and watching her help change in ways that still raise hard questions for me today. I am sharing this not to place blame, but to shine light. Because if even one family feels more informed, more supported, or more empowered to ask better questions, then this story matters. Caregiving doesn't usually begin with certainty. It begins with concern, with small changes that don't quite make sense, moments that feel off, behaviors that don't match the person you know. For my sister, those changes came early, before the age of 60, and that detail matters. She was eventually diagnosed with early onset dementia, a condition defined by symptoms appearing before age 65. What many people don't realize is that early onset dementia is not common. And when it does appear early, it should immediately trigger a careful, thorough, and cautious investigation. Not rush conclusions, not assumptions, not a one-size-fits-all approach. But that's not always how it works. Too often, care still falls into those patterns. What I have found is too often, families and even some medical professionals may treat a diagnosis as the final answer. But in my experience, a diagnosis really meant to be a starting point, not the finish line. When my sister came into my care, her diagnosis had already been made, and what I felt first was curiosity. Her age didn't align with what I understood about dementia, and something in me questioned it because she was in her 50s. I wondered if she had suffered a stroke or another neurological event, something that might explain the changes I was seeing, but that possibility was never confirmed. Dementia is not just a diagnosis. It is a life-altering label. Once it enters the room, everything begins to shift. How care is approached, how decisions are made, and sometimes how deeply questions are allowed to go. And when curiosity fades, assumptions quietly takes its place. Instead of asking why, the system often moves straight to how do we manage this? Here's what I learned the hard way. When dementia symptoms appear early, every possible cause should be explored. That includes medical conditions that affect the brain, like thyroid imbalances or infections, nutritional deficiencies, such as B12 deficiency, which can affect memory and cognition. Medication reactions can produce confusion, forgetfulness, or muscle control problems that look like dementia. Mental health conditions that can mimic cognitive decline. Neurological issues like strokes, mini strokes, or other brain challenges can look like cognitive decline. When these aren't considered, there could be misdiagnosis. And as time proceeds, family may assume the disease is progressing naturally, when in fact, the condition might be treatable or preventable. Too often, these questions are skipped. And once dementia is written into a chart, it becomes the lens through which everything else is viewed. One of the most painful lessons I learned was this: not everything mental health actually does. Over time, my sister was placed on medications intended to manage symptoms. Some were meant to stabilize, some to calm, others to slow what was believed to be progression. But medications don't exist in isolation. They interact and they compound. And some can affect the body in ways that are deeply alarming, as with my sister, impacting muscle control, balance, and even the ability to use the tongue properly or swallow safely. I began to see changes that looked less like disease progression and more like the body struggling under the weight of treatment. Suddenly, there was instability, frequent falls, difficulty standing or walking without assistance, trouble swallowing, loss of speech, and a loss of coordination that made even simple movements feel dangerous. These effects are widely documented side effects of certain medications, particularly when used long-term or in combination, yet they are often attributed solely to disease progression. This is where the line becomes dangerously blurred, because when medication side effects mimic worsening illness, the response is often to increase treatment rather than question it. So instead of asking, could this be the medication, the response becomes, we need to increase the dose, or let's add something else. This is how overmedication happens quietly, not through neglect, but through systems that move faster than families can keep up with. As my questions continued, the focus gradually shifted from understanding what had caused my sister's changing to managing what the diagnosis now represented. Conversations moved away from investigation and toward care plans, routines, and placement. And before there was space to fully explore every possibility, I found myself navigating the world of long-term care. Long-term care doesn't arrive with announcement. It enters quietly, often under the weight of urgency, fear, and concern. Decisions are made quickly, guided by what feels necessary in the moment, rather than what feels fully understood. What begins as support slowly becomes structure, and structure, once in place, is rarely questioned. It was in this transition that I began to realize how easily a diagnosis can shape the direction of care, sometimes closing doors that were never meant to be closed. Long-term care is not just a place, it's a world. It's a world with its own language, rules, routines, and pressures. Families are expected to make complex medical decisions while emotionally exhausted, grieving the person they are slowly losing, and often without complete information. You're told what is standard, what is best practice, what is necessary. But rarely are you told what alternatives exist, what questions you should be asking, what risk comes with compliance, or what happens if you say no. I watched my sister's world shrink, not just because of her condition, but because of other decisions made without full transparency. There came a point when I had to ask myself a hard question. Was what we were doing truly helping her, or simply managing her for the system's convenience? That's a painful realization because it forces you to confront the possibility that harm can happen even when everyone believes they're doing the right thing. I began noticing patterns, timing, changes that followed medication adjustments, and I realized something crucial. Families are often the first to notice harm, but the last to be taken seriously. That gap, the space between lived experience and clinical authority, is where so many people fall through the cracks. Don't fall through the cracks. If there's one thing I want you to take from this episode, it is this. You are allowed to and should ask questions. You are allowed to slow down and pause decisions. You are allowed to request second opinions. You are allowed to ask what happens if you don't agree. You are allowed to ask for different alternatives, especially with early onset diagnosis, especially with the medications, especially when something doesn't feel right. Dementia may be real, but misdiagnosis is also real. Medication harm is real, and systems are not infallible. Your voice matters. I wish I had come across a podcast like this years ago. It would have mattered. My sister's health today reflects many factors, some unavoidable, some uncertain, some that in hindsight deserved deeper examination. I carry that knowledge now, not with guilt, but with purpose, because stories like hers deserve to be told. And families like yours deserve more than silence, confusion, and compliance. This is Care and Memory Shadow, a place where we talk about what's hidden, where we ask questions others don't, and where care is paired with understanding, not fear. Thank you for being here, and thank you for listening. In the next episode, we will talk about early onset dementia and why rare should never mean rushed, and what families should insist on before accepting a diagnosis. Until next time, take care of yourself and those you love. A gentle disclaimer. I want to be very clear and responsible in saying this. This podcast is not medical advice. I am not a doctor, and nothing shared here is meant to replace professional medical guidance, diagnosis, or treatment. What I share comes from lived experience, caregiving, observation, research, and reflection. My intention is to encourage informed conversations, thoughtful questions, and advocacy, not to diagnose or direct care decisions. Every situation is different, and listeners should always consult qualified healthcare professionals regarding their specific circumstances. Again, take care of yourself and those you love.